Hello, brilliant to see such a packed room. Not that I'm really surprised, as when I was first asked would I do this session with Maggie, and I think I replied absolutely instantly. I have to say, not because of the beautiful surroundings, lovely though they are, but because I've been such an admirer of Maggie O'Farrell's work for many, many years now, and what a treat to be able to talk to one of your favourite writers about their work. And I was trying to think, why do I like Maggie's writing so much? And I think it's because every novel, every book feels so different. You don't know what you're going to get. The settings range from contemporary to historical, very memorable, very distinct characters. But the writing is so exceptional on the page. And I read very quickly. It's a fault of being a journalist, I think. And with Maggie's writing, I slow down to savour every telling detail, and you realise why everything has been put the way it is. So in the course of this hour, we're going to be hearing about her life in writing, including her most recent book, which I highly recommend. If none of you, I'm sure many of you will have read it, The Marriage Portrait. And we're going to hear questions from you at the end, so do have a think about what you'd like to ask. I always find it surprising. There's sometimes a tumbleweed moment when the interview comes to an end and nobody dares ask a question. So do have a think about that. And we're going to hear a reading as well from Maggie too. And then after the whole session, there are going to be signings in the bookshop. And just to let you know, Maggie won't literally be signing because of a hand issue, but she's got a very fancy stamp which she's just showed off to me. So she's happy to chat, and you'll be the guinea pigs for her wonderful stamp. So welcome.
Thank you.
And I wanted to start off because the headline of this session is called The Fables of Maggie O'Farrell, which I thought was an intriguing title. And I wanted to ask you whether, as a child, were you brought up on myths? Were you brought up on legends? Was that part of your childhood?
Books were always a big part, actually, and particularly because when I was 8, I was very ill, so I was in bed for almost 2 years, and this was in a time back in the 80s where this was before, any kind of on-demand TV or any audiobooks, really. So that's literally all I did for 2 years. It was just read, which was fantastic. So, but I did, and actually my dad in particular, so my parents were very, they always read us stories at night time, and my mum particularly is a very good raconteur. She loves to relate sort of oral stories, but my dad would only ever read us Irish mythology, and he was very strict about it, and I used to get really annoyed, and we'd say, please will you read The Secret Garden, please can you read Pippi Longstocking, but he'd say, no, I'll only read Irish mythology, which, I mean, it was wonderful but irritating. We got very annoyed with him. But now, actually, I am sort of grateful to him, actually, for his incredible kind of myopic nationalism, because those stories are very much the bedrock, in a sense, of my sense of narrative. There's something particularly... the most vivid thing I think about Irish mythology, which I carry with me, is the fact that land is narrative and narrative is land, that the landscape is alive, that rocks are alive and creatures live in bogs and trees can speak to you and they're filled with fairies. And I think that still, it's very much a part of the way I see stories and I see narrative now, I think.
And it's true, actually, when you go to Ireland and you talk to anybody about their land, their fields, they'll talk about, there's the 1912 land survey, they'll talk about something as if it was yesterday. That's nothing 100 years ago.
Well, land is a very fraught issue in Ireland, obviously, historically, about who it belongs to and why it belongs, and also the idea that there's this whole kind of myth that pre-Celts and Gaels, that the tribe that lived there literally went underground. They went underground because of the invading Celts, and they live inside the soil, which I still find quite thrilling.
And I'm interested to know a bit more about that Irish part of you, the British part of you, partly because that's my own background from Dublin. I've lived in Edinburgh, lived in England as well. And you described yourself, which I thought was a very interesting and good way of putting it, as a hyphenated person.
Yeah, well, I do think of myself as that. I think I was born in Ireland. I was born in Derry a few months after Bloody Sunday. So we left when I was a toddler, and as you can tell by the way I speak, I've mostly grown up over here. So I think it is one of those things. I think it's a very common feeling for people who don't necessarily grow up where they were born, that you feel at once belonging to both nations, but actually neither as well. We came... it wasn't that easy, really, growing up with an Irish surname in the 70s and 80s in Britain. You know, that obviously there's a long and fraught history between our two countries, and it was it was at a special low, really, during those decades for obvious reasons. And so it was, you know, and that kind of ranged from Irish jokes, which are quite tedious, as I'm sure you know,
yes,
to, I mean, I did have teachers who would take the register and say to me, "Oh, is your family in the IRA?" You know, which is quite an extraordinary way to begin a lesson for a 12-year-old. And I'd have to explain. I always learnt to say no, they're not. You know, it was odd, you know. So it is, but it is very much. But no, so I think it is a strange sense that you do belong to both, but actually neither as well. You know, because you are other in the country in which you are living in, but also when you go home. Our cousins used to call us the English cousins, even though we never actually lived in England. We were living in Wales and then Scotland. So I think it's a confusing. You do get a confused sense of identity, definitely. But at the same time, I think it does make you into an observer, definitely.
Yes.
Which I'm sure has, but you know, I think there's a whole debate about whether writers are made or whether writers are born, and I think it's probably a bit of both always. You know, it's a big mix of all sorts of different kind of propensities that you're born with, and also the pressure of experiences that change you. But in a way, I think it's something that's definitely fed into. I think if you do move schools a lot, which I did, you walk into a new comprehensive, and instantly you're looking around thinking, okay, what are the social rules here? You know, which group can I merge in with? Which group can I camouflage with? Which are the predators that I need to avoid? You know, you are already somebody looking very carefully at the way people are behaving and dressing and speaking.
But that way of both observing, being slightly an outsider, but learning how to assimilate. I mean, I can see why that does help you as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of the many things that I think feed into it, certainly.
And this idea of what makes a writer, I think you said something very interesting, which was not that you wanted to be a writer, which a lot of people think about. It's a very funny Michael Frey novel where he imagines the blurb for the book he hasn't written yet, and you know, probably coming to events like this without actually having written anything. And that you, from a very early age, wanted to write, didn't you? It was a kind of compulsion with you.
Yeah, apparently it's called graphomania, which is a nice word. And I don't really remember a time without it. I don't know where it came from, because there are no writers in my family, so I don't know whether that bit was born or made, but all I remember is this very, very strong urge to do it, to put words down on paper, and almost to make something that wasn't there before to exist. And I do remember at the age of probably about 5, actually, saying to my mum, I really want to write a poem, but I don't know how to. I said, so can you write it for me? And she said, which, I mean, she was probably very busy and making a dinner or something. And she said, well, if I wrote it, it would be my poem, not yours. And this was an absolute revelation to me. I remember standing in the kitchen thinking, you know, the idea of authorship had struck me for the first time. And she doesn't remember. I tell her the story and she said, oh, it's probably just really busy and I was just trying to get you to go away. But it did spur me on to write. I made a really terrible poem about my cat, but you know, it was my first. I remember it was my first conscious act of writing.
And how did that continue, the writing?
Well, I did it all the time. I don't know why. I just always had the urge to put words on paper. So I have diaries and notebooks going back to when I was quite young. And it never really occurred to me to think or to articulate the desire I want to be a writer. You know, when I was young, it wasn't that I was going. I mean, I went to the library every week and took out my 3 books, but I never went to a literary festival. And in a sense, writers were a bit like a sort of Greek gods to me. They were kind of distant people, probably dead. You know, it never occurred to me they were actually alive people. There were people alive writing. That they were very distant and totally unreachable, and probably not even real somehow. They're like Greek. You know, they were sort of existed in this other parallel Olympian mountain. And I do remember when I was probably about 14 or 15, Liz Lockhead came to my local library.
The poet who went on
poet.
to be the Scottish poet laureate. Yeah.
And that was absolutely astonishing. She went and she was very funny and very personal, and I thought, this is a human being. And look, she's got books with her name on it, and just being amazed by that.
Yeah. And you mentioned the illness that you had as a child, and I think which was very serious and left you with some problems that have persisted. But you change your assessment about that, don't you? About whether it was really nothing at all or whether it was life-changing.
Yeah, so I was ill for quite a long time and I had to relearn. They thought I was going to die at first, and I did hear a nurse saying that outside my room. So that was a big surprise to me when I was about 8 or 9. And then they said I wouldn't walk again. but it's actually due mostly to physiotherapists that I can walk and hold a pen and lead an ambulatory life, because the doctor said she is, there's no point in giving her physiotherapy. But there was one physiotherapist, I remember her very clearly, who said, I think I'd like to try. So yes, it's thanks to her actually that I can lead the life I do. So obviously I love physiotherapists and all who sail in them. I would do anything for physios.
But that moment, hearing somebody talking about, you heard, didn't you, because you write about it in your wonderful memoir, I Am, and you don't realise they're talking about you, do you?
Yes, so I was I was in intensive care in a kind of isolation room, and somebody was walking past the open door of my room, and it was a child, and the nurse was coming after the child and saying, you must be quiet because there's a little girl dying in that room. And I remember thinking, my first thought was how awful to be dying as that poor little girl, to be dying as a child. And then the nurse who was watching me looked really embarrassed and jumped up and shut the door. And then I thought, oh, they mean me. And it was such a kind of,
the nurse blushed, didn't she? Yes.
And then I thought a bit stupid, because I thought, actually, how did I not realise that? Of course, it's me. Of course. What else does all this mean? This room and these machines. So yes, but I don't consider myself unlucky to have caught that virus and to have had that experience. I consider myself astonishingly lucky. I feel as though I won several hundred lotteries and pools because I got better.
Oh, well, that's an amazing approach that you can do. I mean, and not only did you get better from that, but you've survived a great many, as you describe them, 17 brushes with death, which is the subtitle of the memoir. Some of them are very, very tragic, very, very difficult to read. But there is one where you almost slightly kind of mock yourself. And I don't know what, I think it'd be really good for you to explain to everybody here how you got yourself into this situation, which was you were at a music festival.
Oh, yes.
And I can't believe this story, but carry on.
Yes, I was at Glastonbury a long time ago, and in fact, it's awful. My editor has a thing about knives, and she said, I can't read that chapter, I just can't read it. And I said, I'm really sorry. So I did, and they asked for a volunteer for a knife thrower. And actually, in my defence, I didn't volunteer, but my friend next to me held my hand up and said, she'll do it. So actually, it wasn't entirely my fault, but I did do it. And as I was walking into the arena, I was thinking, I'm not sure this is a good idea. And the knife thrower put a blindfold on, and I thought, that's really, really not a good idea. But then I was buckled to a board. But you see, it was fine. I've learned to live the tale. One of my very good friends, he read quite an early manuscript of that memoir, and he said to me, I am never getting on a plane with you, ever. That's it, we're never going on holiday together.
But it's an astonishing story, but also, as I've said at the outset, there's sort of a telling detail as you hear the knives going so close to you, and his assistant saying in Spanish, demasiado cerca, too close, as they say. But that memoir, all the different 17 brushes could have in themselves been the centerpiece of a novel in some way, had you been that kind of writer. And I was just wondering, why did you decide that you wanted to go down the non-fiction route rather than, I'm not saying you never use incidents from your life, because clearly you do, but I just wondered why you wanted to set them out in non-fiction.
Well, it's funny, I never thought I would write a memoir. My husband says that I'm the most secretive person he's ever met. He says, both of us work from home, and sometimes I'm leaving the house, and he says, where are you going? And I say, I'm just going out. And actually, I'm just going to the post office. It's not as if I'm having a really exciting affair or anything. I'm not going anywhere exciting, but I just find it hard to be able to, pin myself down like that. So when I told him I was going to write it, he said, it's going to be very short. You're not going to say anything about yourself. But it just seemed to me, it's funny, I've always felt in a sense that you don't always choose the books that you want to write. The books choose you. There's a kind of level of instinct, I think, is at work there. And I was actually planning to write Hamnet, or I was going to have a shot at writing Hamnet. I wasn't sure if I could do it, but I thought, oh, that's what I'll do next. But actually, while I was reading, and very voraciously, because I love doing research, I was reading lots of biographies about Shakespeare. In the back of the notebook that I was making my notes about Shakespeare, just kind of started evolving these longer biographical pieces about times that I'd nearly died. But I think in a strange way, I always feel that the sequence in which you write your books are weirdly linked. There's a kind of strand of very coiled, complicated DNA that runs through it. And in a way, I don't think I could have written Hamnet until I had written I Am, because in a sense, Hamnet is about, obviously, the death, the unavoidable, horrible death of a young child. And in a sense, I wanted to write about my own, confrontations with mortality. And I thought it just seemed to me a very interesting lens through which to view a life. I've always felt that chronology, as a kind of narrative propulsive force, doesn't really interest me that much. So I've always thought that actually narrative and the way our memories work and our minds and our brains and our sense of ourselves and others and our relationships with others is not a neat chronological flow from A to B. It's much more complicated and twisted than that. So that's where it just seemed to me that instead of writing a chronological account of my life, which I would never do, because it would be too boring, actually. I'd be bored to write it, let alone ask others to read it. But in terms of looking at a lens, and also I wanted to arrange it by body part rather than by the abstract concept of time.
Yes, so it's all the different bits of terrifying things that have happened to different parts of your body. I'm interested, and I want to pick up on what you just said there about narrative, because I think that is a very strong characteristic of the way that you write, and very complex, often differing timelines. And you did that from the very outset. Your first novel was like that. And I reread it for this, and it was just, for a first book, it's sort of technically so clever, but then it sort of feeds into something else you were saying, which is almost like you sort of delude yourself in the writing process, so you weren't really writing a memoir. And with this book, you kept telling everybody it was a short story.
Yes, well, I don't know, especially with your first book, I don't think anyone really in their right mind really sits down and thinks, okay, I'm going to write a novel, I'm going to begin today and I'm going to start with chapter 1. Or I just can't do that, I really can't. And I never, even now, when I have written, a few novels, even I have to kind of trick myself into starting, and I have to kind of sidle up to it sideways and not really pretend to myself that I'm not doing anything significant or important that day. And I certainly never begin at the beginning. Beginnings are really hard. You've got to know exactly where your story needs to start, and you've got to set out your story, you've got to establish your characters and their relationships and your setting. I mean, it's amazing that anyone writes a novel, really. So I never start at the beginning, and I always just start with whatever bit happens to float to the surface in a way, in a sense.
And what floated to the surface with that?
With
after you'd gone?
With After You'd Gone. Actually, very strangely, I wrote the first bit of After You'd Gone quite a long time before I ever started it properly as a novel. And I know exactly what it was. I was about 23 and I was backpacking back from Hong Kong, where I'd been working, back to the UK, overland, and I went to Tolstoy's house in Moscow, and it was nobody else there. And I have a real obsession with writers' houses, or museum of writers' houses. I go wherever I am in the world, you can always find one. So I went to this one. I mean, I love Tolstoy as well, so I did go deliberately. And it was very, very quiet and really quite spooky. And I was walking along, and I suddenly saw a huge mirror that I thought was another room. And I saw myself in it, and I gave myself a fright, because I thought, who's that person? And I thought, oh, it's me. And then I went back to my horrible hostel that I caught bed bugs in. And I wrote what actually now starts, I think, part 2, of the novel. And it's almost unchanged in the back of my kind of travel diary. It's right there. And then years later, I found it again, and I decided to write a longer story about it.
And then you were given a lot of help at the Arvin Foundation, weren't you?
Yes, so that's right. So I had about probably about 20,000 words of what I thought was perhaps a novel. When I look back at it now, it was an absolute dog's dinner. I mean, it's astonishing that they read it patiently. But I went on a course at the Arvin Foundation for, I think, starting to write a novel or writing a novel. And I was taught by Barbara Trapido and Elspeth Barker, who were an amazing double act. And so I handed it in, as you do, and then I went to the workshops. And then about a day later, they both said to me, rather kind of gravely, we need to talk to you. And I thought... In my office now. I know, basically that. And they were both quite imposing women, as it still are. Well, Elspeth is sadly dead now, but... So I instantly thought, okay, they hated what they read so much that I'm going to be thrown off the course. They're going to ask me to leave. So I went in slightly kind of depressed, and I sat down, and they said, we really like it, and you need to carry on, and when you've finished, we'll send it to our agent. And I was absolutely astonished, and I was so astonished that I ran out of the centre. This is in Yorkshire, in the middle of nowhere, and it was winter. It was about February, so it was winter time, and it was pitch dark, and I ran with such joy, and then I fell into a massive ditch that was filled with icy and possibly kind of manure flavoured water, and up to about here. And I was trying to get out, and it was really slippery, and I did think, I'm never going to get out of here, and I'm never going to finish my novel. So I had to... In fact, I should have put it in my memoir, really.
I should have, yeah, 18 brushes with death, and I'm definitely not going on a plane with you, madam.
I did manage to crawl out of the primordial swamp and finish my book. So no, I love Avon. I'm a big supporter of Avon. It's a great place. If anyone's thinking or even contemplating writing anything, please get yourself on an Avon course. They are fantastic ways to spur you on. And but be careful of the ditches.
But such generosity of spirit, and is that something? Is that generally sort of companionship with other writers, that people know that what you've been through, or is there kind of frenemies under the surface?
No, I mean, I have to say, I find the kind of community of writers incredibly supportive and mutually amicable, and I've never really come across, I mean, it has a reputation, I don't know why, of being this very sort of envious, sort of slightly bitchy group, but it's never been my experience. I've only met really lovely people.
And wonderful to get that kind of encouragement so early on in your career.
Yeah.
I wanted to go on a slight detour because you mentioned Hong Kong, and this was a chaotic period in your life, and there was a rather wonderful encounter last night with you and my old colleague Emily Maitlis. In fact, it's quite an interesting story about paths not taken.
Yes, so Emily Maitlis, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, came up to me last night and said, it's so lovely to meet you. And I had to say to her, actually, we've met before. Because about 30 years ago, I had just arrived in Hong Kong and I really needed a job. And I'd heard that there was a tutor leaving this kind of, in Hong Kong at that time, which was pre-handover, there were these kind of tutorial colleges where they would employ young, penniless graduates to tutor O-level and A-level students in various subjects. So someone had told me there was a job vacancy, so I went along and I had an interview, and I met the tutor who was about to leave to go to a job in radio and television in Hong Kong. Now, can you guess who it was? It was someone called Emily Maitlis. And we were sitting in a tiny cubicle, so small that our knees were kind of touching. And we had a long chat about, at that time she had very curly hair, mysteriously. So we talked about the humidity of Hong Kong and curls, and she was knitting something really beautiful. I didn't know she could knit, but she can. And we had this chat, and then I went for the interview, which I thought, that went okay. And then later that day I got a telephone call and they said, we liked you, but you don't have as many talents as Emily Maitlis. So we're not giving you the job. So sadly, I still don't have as many talents as Emily Maitlis.
Who does?
Who does? It's true. They were right.
And the knitting as well, I didn't know about that bit. But travelling has been a very important part of your life, hasn't it? You get kind of urges where you have to go travelling. Really.
I know, I am. It's a bit of a failing. I'm terribly restless, and I do have very itchy feet. And if I have been at home for too long, it's a very irritating habit of mine, but I will start moving furniture around just because. So my husband says it's really common. He goes out he plays in his band, or he goes out and plays football, and he comes back and the house has completely changed. And he just says, oh, God, I think it's time we booked a little holiday, isn't it? Because I just kind of think, if I just move the sofa over here, everything will feel different.
Before walls are demolished.
It's a bit, luckily, I don't have the physical strength to do that, otherwise I probably might.
Yeah. He's a writer as well, doesn't he? Is that an advantage? I mean, he's an early reader of your work, isn't he?
Yes. So, well, actually, we've known each other for quite a long time. I met him when I was 18, but we weren't together until about 10 years later. But I mean, in some ways, I think it's just like any other couple who happen to be in the same job. There's a lot less you have to explain. So if I walk into his office and he says, "Don't come in now, not now," I don't take it the wrong way. I just think, oh, okay, he's busy, I'm writing. So in a sense, yes. But he is always my first reader, and he can be pretty mean. He does. In fact, one of the things I have on my desk is, he'd probably be annoyed with me telling you this, but I have a cast of his teeth. He had it made for that weird sort of gum shield that you have to have when you play contact sports. And he had it, and he was about to throw it out. And I said, no, can I have it? Because I have it on my desk. And if I am... there's a certain mood that I get into if I'm writing, and I think, oh, this is going well. I really love that word. And then I look at his teeth, and I think, he's going to hate it. So it sort of tends to, it's a reminder to curb my more sort of purple prose propensities, I think.
And are you aware of other readers when you're writing? Are you, or is he more important, or do you think of an editor or an agent or the world of sensitivity readers, or you know, what's?
No, I don't actually. I mean, that comes later, but certainly in I'm about halfway through a first draft at the moment, which is, I think my most favourite part, actually, of the whole process, just because I know that nobody is going to look at my first draft. It's just for me, and it's just me and my imaginary friends, and we're sitting in my studio, and we're having long conversations, and it's really fun. But no, I had to completely switch off the idea that anyone is going to read it. I can't imagine anything more disconcerting than this kind of imaginary person looking over your shoulder as you type. So no, I don't think, and I never ever talk about what I'm writing, so if I haven't finished it yet. So I don't even talk to my husband about it. I will talk to his teeth. You know, we have a kind of silent.
Well, that doesn't surprise me when you won't even tell him when you're going out or when
I know exactly. But he says he can usually guess just by the books that arrive in the house or the places that I disappear off to. So I think he has a rough idea, to be fair, but I won't ever talk about it. Because actually, and it's partly because I have a sort of superstition, I think, in a way, that if I talk about something that I haven't finished, then it'll drain me of the urge to actually write it. But also, I think, you know, because as I said, he's always my first reader, and I think you can't squander too much chat about it. You know, I think someone's first reading is so valuable.
So you want that really fresh eye.
Yeah, he absolutely has. He has to know nothing about it. And if I went in at lunchtime and chatted about my plot twist in chapter 5, then he's going to know it and expect it. So he won't be reading it as a kind of normal reader would. And
you need complete silence, don't you, to write, which must be difficult in what sounds like quite a busy family house.
It is, and also it's tricky because Will, my husband, he loves jazz, which I loathe. I really do. I'm sorry if there are any jazz fans in the audience. I mean, I love music. I love all kinds of music, but jazz, it has a sort of similar effect, I imagine, that strobe lighting does on epileptics. It's just, I can't listen. So we do have a bit of a problem with that, but I actually...
It might be called phonophobia. I remember something on my programme, we did something about it. Things that set people, things like people slurping tea too loudly. Really.
That doesn't bother me. I'm fine with that. But I love music, but it's just when I'm working, I have to have silence. So I sometimes wear ear defenders, and I also have... I have quite a nice studio in the garden now, which is quite a new thing. It was started being built in February 2020, and then painfully, for 2 years, it was just foundations. And occasionally, one of my children has a photo of me sitting in it, very sadly, just with no roof. I was just imagining myself there. So, but it's now finished and it has a roof, so I can go in there. But it would have been good to have it in 2021, but you know.
Did you end up, I think I read this, that you ended up in a Wendy house at one stage to try and escape.
It's very true. So, yes, during 2020-21, I don't need to explain why, I was, like lots of other people, stuck at home, and I had 3 children homeschooling who were in various stages of fury about lockdown. My son was 16, he was really furious for almost a year and a half, as you would be, I think, as a 16-year-old. So, life was busy, put it this way. And there was one day when I think it was my husband's turn to kind of be on the homeschooling watch, and I was desperately trying to find headspace to write this. But every 2 seconds, somebody would burst into the room where I was saying, "I've lost my pencil case. I can't find my French homework. I need a jam jar now." So eventually, I thought I actually went and hid in my youngest daughter's Wendy house in the garden, which is very low roofed, and it was ergonomically not good because I had to crouch in there. But I pulled the door shut, and it was magic because nobody found me for about 2 hours. Apart from the cats, who all kind of gathered really uneasily outside the door, as if to say, "What are you doing?" This unusual behaviour, they didn't like it. But no, it was great. So I would recommend to anybody, if they need some time and space, get a Wendy house.
And you mentioned the idea of kind of books arriving at the house as research for whatever you're working on. And is that an important part of the process for you, an enjoyable part of the process, necessary?
Well, it depends on the book, obviously, and the last two that I've written, obviously this one and Hamnet, did require a lot of research. I did find it almost impossible to write a novel about the 16th century without knowing quite a lot about the 16th century. But actually, I love it. You know, I am absolutely what people would, you know, in my day I was called a swot, but these days I'd be called a nerd, and I wear that badge proudly.
Embrace it, yes.
I am absolutely would wear that, yeah. So, yeah, I love it. But I think the thing is, I think one of the things, you know, it's fascinating. I love learning things, and I love reading books, and, you know, works of biography and history amaze me because just the kind of, it's such a different process to the one that I am involved with, which is just, you just make stuff up. You know, historians who have to stick to the truth and trawl through archives, I still am very impressed by that. But in a sense, actually, it's partly that I love learning things, but also, you know, with every novel, there's always, even if you're making the whole thing up from start to finish, there are always going to be weeks or days where you hit a brick wall and you just can't go any further and you can't see your way forward. And if you're writing a contemporary novel which requires no research, you will spend that week being miserable and thinking, I have to find a proper job, what am I doing with my life? But if you're doing research, it's great because you can just go to the library and just read a few more books about, you know, something really obscure that you'll probably never end up in the novel, but you feel as though you're, you know, purposeful.
Or go to a physical setting. When you talked about Tolstoy's house, but I think you went to Shakespeare's house, didn't you, for Hamnet?
Yeah, so for Hamnet I did. I spent a week actually in Stratford going round and round the houses, and they are astonishing. You know, I mean, if anyone even has got a passing interest in Shakespeare, please go, because it's just, they're the most amazing thing. I mean, it seems so unlikely that they've existed and they're still there and looked after. And, you know, Shakespeare is someone who, there's still so much about him that we don't know. There's so many gaps in his story. But at the same time, you can buy a ticket and you can walk into the room where he was born. And that to me is still extraordinary, even though I've been around it 1,000 times and I've asked every guide in every room a million questions. Yeah, they're amazing. So I did do that. But actually for Hamnet, I did other things. I actually went and learned to fly a kestrel with a hawker. Yeah, in the Scottish borders.
Don't tell me, is this going to be another brush with death?
No, not at all. It's very safe. Although actually some mice did die, I should say. In full disclosure, I didn't kill them, but the kestrel did. So yeah, that's actually the most fun thing I've ever done in the name of work.
I'm going to be so close to a kestrel.
They are so beautiful. But you need to do it. You know, you need that kind of physical experience, because I had written the scene in which Hamlet's mother is flying a kestrel, and I had described this kestrel landing on her glove with a thud. And then I went to do it. I flew this hawk, and I realised the kestrel's about the weight of a kitten. And of course they're a brilliant predator because they are totally silent and they don't land with a thud anywhere. You know, they will land with utter stealth and silence and incredible poise and grace. So yes, that's why you need to know. That's why you need to do it.
To stave off those angry letters from falconers around the country.
There's a lot of those. I call them just so you know. Just so you know letters, you do get a lot of those.
Oh, just so you know.
Or I think you'll find. They often start with I think you'll find.
Quite a few of those people do listen to Radio 4.
Yes, I can imagine. There's a strong Venn diagram.
I cannot believe it when you split that infinitive. But anyway. So Hamnet was such a powerful, gut-wrenching kind of emotional book, and that it's coming onto the stage, isn't it? Soon,
yeah.
How much have you been involved in that?
Well, not a huge amount. It's been adapted by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and Lalita Chakrabarti has done the adaptation brilliantly, actually, I have to say. And she was very generous and shared several drafts with me. So she's done a wonderful job of disassembling the novel and reassembling it in a kind of chronological stretch. You know, the novel... Actually, Hamnet is one of the most straightforward time frame novels that I've ever written, but it does flip between... it flips between sort of two strands of about 15 years apart. And... So and I think that's fine to do on the page, but in a theatre you can't keep, moving through time. So she's done that, and I've been to several rehearsals. But essentially at the very start of the whole process, when somebody says, "Do you want to agree to the Royal Shakespeare Company making a play of your novel about Shakespeare?" you don't really say, "Actually, no. What do they know?" So I did actually have a long conversation with my agent, who told me, that they'd inquired about it. And we had this long conversation about how it might work. And at the end of it, there was a long pause. And she said, "So, do you want to say yes?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, did I not say yes? Definitely. Yes, please."
Yes. But it must be a strange kind of thing, having kind of an afterlife in that way. But yeah.
It is, it's extraordinary. But I think you have to... I went into it knowing and being happy about the idea that the play will sit alongside the novel. You know, it isn't going to be the exact same book story, because but it's the same story, but it's not the same experience, because it is, you know, naturally it's different. So it sits alongside it, and there's quite a lot of Lolita, and there's quite a lot of me as well. So yeah, but it's amazing. I mean, the RSC have done a beautiful job. It's absolutely exquisite. The acting is fantastic. The music's gorgeous. The setting, the costumes, it's all just so perfect. Yeah, it's a real joy.
And you must have been very pleased with the kind of reaction that you got to the novel Hamnet, didn't you? People really loved it. Yeah.
Well, it's strange because it all happened during lockdown, so in a way it was all very much at arm's length. Yeah. Which I think was quite lucky in a way, because I think, in a sense, it was the least weird thing that was happening in 2020. You know, there was so much else going on, but it's always wonderful. It's wonderful if one person loves your book, and it's wonderful if.
But of course, suppose there weren't prize ceremonies, or that's right.
Yeah, yes. Everything was distant, and I, instead of being at things like this, talking to actual people, I was just talking into a Zoom screen. So it was all very much. At a distance in a way.
Yeah, I'd had a weird experience. I was chairing the Bailey Gifford Non-Fiction Prize, and it was great in a way, because for once I had time to read the books really well. I had a whole, very nice other judges, all on Zoom. And then to announce the prize, looking back it seems so peculiar, but they actually sent a kind of lectern to our cottage in the middle of Suffolk. And then Chris, my husband who's there, had to film me kind of announcing the winner, and it was Craig Brown, and we got him on a Zoom call, and somehow there was pretending it was going to be a sound check, and he got more and more grumpy, and I went, and Craig, you've won. And it was like, what did you say, Martha? And it's at the moment that they'd been recording that they hoped was going to be this glorious. I think did you have a similar experience, or you went quite? I did. Kate Moss for the Women's
Yes, that's
Prize.
right. So I did I was on the shortlist for the Women's Prize, and I did a kind of online event with another writer, and we did it, and it was all fine. And then I kind of logged off, and then I went into the kitchen, and the cat had been sick on the floor. So I was really annoyed, and I was mopping up the cat sick, and I'd taken off my kind of smart, top. And then I had a text message from Kate Moss saying, "Can you just jump back on the Zoom call?" And I thought, I don't want to. So I thought, I'll just pretend I didn't get it. And I carried on cleaning up the cat sick. And then she said, "No, we really need you to get back on the Zoom call." So I thought, fine. Slammed down my back. I thought, God, just do this. And I got back on the Zoom call. And then they said, "Oh, you've won, by the way." I thought, oh. So I was really shocked. Because if you're on a shortlist as I was with Hilary Mantel and Bernie Deveristo, I wasn't expecting to win. I was just very happy to be part of the shortlist party. Yeah. So I was shocked, but I was also, from the waist down, wearing cat vomit stained trousers, from the waist up wearing it, putting on my blouse again. So no, I was very surprised in a number of ways.
Very, very well deserved. And then it sounds like it was during that stage you were during lockdown, you started working on the marriage portrait by then, had you? Yeah.
Yes. So actually writing this book was pretty much bookended by the pandemic, because I had the idea. I know exactly when it was. It was my daughter's, what turned out to be my daughter's last play date, and I was sitting outside my friend's house waiting for her to come out. And I was, that sounded like a ghost, didn't it? And I was rereading Robert Browning's poem, My Last Touches, which I do sometimes because it's one of my favourites. I do love it. And I often read it when I'm between books, so I read a lot of his dramatic monologues, just because they are so good. God, they're amazing. I mean, they're beautiful in language, their psychological insight is incredible, and just technically they're jaw-dropping, all those kind of rhyming couplets and the... Yeah, so anyway, I won't go off on that one about that. So I was reading it, and I was just wondering to myself whether or not it was based on real people, because he did write a lot of dramatic monologues about real people. And so I looked it up, and I had her name and the fact that she'd been 16 when she died. And then there's one portrait of her. She's called Lucrezia de Medici, and it's done by Bronzino. And a lot of Bronzino's portraits of that type look very impassive and expressionless, but she looks anxious, she looks worried. And I think crucially for me, she looks like she has something she wants to say. And so it was very extraordinary, because I find that most ideas for novels have a long lead time, a long gestational period. But this one was a bit like a kind of lightning bolt. I just saw this portrait and I thought, I'm going to write a novel about her.
Yeah, and the kind of the voiceless woman in a way, who you gave a voice to.
Well, I just thought in the poem, the Duke keeps her behind a curtain. He keeps her portrait behind a curtain, which he pulls back occasionally and says, "This is my beautiful young wife. And by the way, I murdered her because she annoyed me." And I just thought, she's been behind that curtain long enough. And I wanted to kind of wrest the curtain from his hand and say, right, that's it. You've had your time. It's her turn to speak now.
And how much were you able to learn about her, the historical figure, and her world?
Well, not a great deal. I mean, despite being born into one of the best, the Medicis, one of the best known dynasties of that time, of that era, there's not a huge amount known about her. And the people around her, obviously her parents are very, very famous. Her father was Cosimo de' Medici and her mother was Eleonora di Toledo. And a lot of her siblings are quite well documented, but she herself seemed to kind of fall underneath the radar of historians and biographers. And even actually, sadly, her parents. So her parents, Cosimo and Eleonora, had an arranged marriage like she did, but they, very unusually, they really loved each other and they really fancied each other and they were faithful to each other, which is even more unusual then. And they wrote a lot of letters when they were apart. And in these letters, there's a lot of kind of a lot of political and fiscal information, but there's also a lot of domestic detail about life in the Palazzo Vecchio, which will be very familiar to anyone who has children. There's, details about who's grown out of their shoes, somebody else is refusing to practice their lute, somebody else won't concentrate in lessons. It's
somebody's cat's been sick.
So, yeah, probably, yes. I imagine they had people to deal with that, the Medicis. But Lucrezia doesn't warrant many mentions, which I find slightly heartbreaking, but I found the absence and silence about her quite telling. So I just immediately got the idea of her as somebody who was overlooked and underloved.
Well, I'd really like you to read some of that and we get a flavour of your writing now. And obviously we're going to be listening to this, and then after we've heard Maggie's reading, it would be great to hear some questions from you, so have a think about those.
Okay, so this is the very beginning of the novel, a chapter called A Wild and Lonely Place. Lucrezia is taking her seat at the long dining table, which is polished to a watery gleam and spread with dishes, inverted cups, a woven circlet of fur. Her husband is sitting down, not in his customary place, but at the opposite end, but next to her, close enough that she could rest her head on his shoulder, should she wish. He is unfolding his napkin and straightening a knife and moving the candle towards them both, when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some coloured glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. She is 16 years old, not quite a year into her marriage. They have travelled for most of the day, using what little daylight the season offers, leaving Ferrara at dawn and riding out to what he had told her was a hunting lodge, far in the northwest of the province. But this is no hunting lodge, is what Lucrezia had wanted to say when they reached their destination, a high-walled edifice of dark stone, flanked on one side by dense forest and on the other by a twisting meander of the Po River. She would have liked to turn in her saddle and ask, "Why have you brought me here?" She said nothing, however, allowing her mare to follow him along the path, through dripping trees, over the arch-back bridge and into the courtyard of the strange, fortified, star-shaped building which seemed, even then, to strike her as peculiarly empty of people. The horses have been led away. She has removed her sodden cloak and hat, and he has watched her do this, standing with his back to the blaze in the grate. And now he is gesturing to the country servants in the hall's outer shadows to step forward and place food on their plates, to slice the bread, to pour wine into their cups. And she is suddenly recalling the words of her sister-in-law, delivered in a hoarse whisper. "You will be blamed." Lucrezia's fingers grip the rim of her plate. The certainty that he means her to die is like a presence beside her, as if a dark feathered bird of prey has alighted on the arm of her chair. This is the reason for their sudden journey to such a wild and lonely place. He has brought her here, to this stone fortress, to murder her. Astonishment yanks her up out of her body and she almost laughs. She is hovering by the vaulted ceiling, looking down at herself and him, sitting at the table, putting broth and salted bread into their mouths. He is sitting an elbow on either side of his plate, telling her about coming to this lodge, as he persists in calling it, when he was a child, how his father used to bring him hunting here. She is listening to a story about how he was made to release arrow after arrow towards a target on a tree until his fingers bled. She is nodding and making sympathetic murmurs at appropriate moments, but what she really wants to do is look him in the eye and say, "I know what you are up to." Would he be surprised, wrong-footed? Does he think of her as his innocent, unworldly wife, barely out of the nursery? She sees it all. She sees he had laid his scheme so carefully, so assiduously, separating her from others, ensuring that her retinue is left behind in Ferrara, that she is alone, that there are no people from the castello here, just him and her, 2 guards stationed outside, and a handful of country servants to wait on them. How will he do it? Part of her would like to ask him this, the knife in a dark corridor, his hands about her throat, A tumble from a horse made her look like an accident. She has no doubt that all of these would fall within his repertoire. It had better be done well, would be her advice to him, because her father is not someone who will take a lenient view of his daughter's murder. She sets down her cup. She lifts her chin. She turns her eyes onto her husband, Alfonso, Duke of Ferrara, and she wonders what will happen next. Thank you.
How can you not want to go on reading after that? It's really intriguing. Lovely. Well, let's have some questions now. We've got a couple of microphones. So, yes, well done. First person. There we are. And there's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you so much. Your books live with me for ages after I've read them. And one thing I've really been pondering over was this Uxor aside. I didn't even know the word before I read The Marriage Portrait. And at the end, when you talk about how you've seen in letters the kind of acknowledgement that this seemed to happen, and I just said, why didn't Henry VIII just do this? And do you have any sort of sense about cultural differences around this norm?
Well, I think, if you compare someone like Alfonso, who I should say, we don't know for sure whether or not he killed her. At the time, there were definitely rumours that he had murdered her, but there are historians who say that she died of natural causes. No one really knows, to be honest. But I do think with Alfonso one of the most convincing things I found was that just after Lucrezia died, two things actually. He sent word to her parents, Cosimo de' Medici and Eleonora, and they sent a letter back very quickly and said, we want our physician to be present at the autopsy. But when the physician from the Florentine palazzo arrived, the autopsy had already been done and Lucrezia was buried under a very large and very heavy marble slab, which I have seen. And also Alfonso stationed a spy in the Florentine court who was reporting back to him at regular intervals about what was happening in the Medici court. And that to me is a very interesting detail, because if you weren't worried about reprisals, then why would you station a spy in your former wife's court? So who knows? But I did get very much an impression of Alfonso as a very cold and quite sadistic man. There's evidence that he was quite proud of this, that when he found out his sister was having an affair with the head of the guards at their castello, he sentenced the man to be strangled in public to death, and he forced his sister to watch. Which to me is just, it's sort of, the crime. The punishment really doesn't fit the crime, if you can call having a love affair a crime. But I just that when I found out that detail, my whole viewpoint on him completely shifted. I actually have a very strong memory of shutting the book where I discovered that and thinking, Alfonso, I'm coming for you. That's it. But I don't think actually there's a huge distinction between someone like Alfonso or Lucrezia's sister Isabella was murdered by her husband, and their youngest brother Pietro, who was by far I think the most disturbed of the Medici children, he killed his wife. He strangled her with a dog lead. But is there much difference between what they do and what Henry VIII did? He didn't literally chop off Anne Boleyn's head, but he just paid someone to do it. I don't think it's a fine distinction, but it's essentially the same thing, isn't it? Murdering your wife.
You didn't think he was going to go to hell, I suppose that was my curiosity.
I don't know. In a sense, I don't know. I find it very hard to put myself inside the mind of somebody who would kill anyone, really, let alone their wife. But in a sense that, in that time and place, if you were a ruler like Alfonso, you were essentially not so much above the law, you made the law, you were the law. So there was no sense that there were going to be any reprisals. And the two, Pietro Medici, who killed his wife, and Isabella's husband, who killed her, they had the tacit approval of the families. And actually, in Isabella's case, her husband had the tacit approval of her brother. He wrote to him and said, she has died, what would you like me to do? Which is a really odd question when you're supposedly telling your brother that his sister is dead. So in a sense, they weren't so much above the law, they made the law so that there was no danger of them getting any kind of punishment for it.
Lovely, thank you. Really interesting question. Yes, this lady here.
How did you grapple with the ethics of reconstructing a real life that actually very little is known about?
I think it is. There are ethics involved in it, as you say, and I think if you are going to choose to write a novel fiction about somebody who was real, I think you have a responsibility to get everything as right as you possibly can. And that involved for me certainly finding out as much as I could about both Lucrezia and Hamnet and Agnes. And then, obviously there are going to be gaps, but in a sense also that's one of the reasons I never mentioned their surnames. That was my kind of rule in a way, that I wanted to make a distinction between the people in my novel who are fictional characters and the people who are buried in either Stratford or Ferrara. It's just a signal to myself, actually, in a sense, and also to readers that this is different. This is my version of something that happened a long time ago. But I do think I also have a strict rule with myself that if I happen to find out something about them that doesn't fit with what I want to say, I have to incorporate it. I can't pretend I didn't read that book. I've got to find a way to write my way around it.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Oh yes, right at the back. Yep. Thank you. Sorry, it's quite dark in this baronial hall. Rather appropriate for discussing historical fiction.
It's a rather suitable hall, really, to have this discussion. I am currently writing a historical novel at the moment, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how do you deal with the sort of things about cultural appropriation now? Because the novel that I'm writing, I discovered after I'd done quite a bit of research, there's actually a dwarf in the place that they were stuck in for about a month, and I immediately wanted to write it from the dwarf's point of view, and then I thought I probably couldn't, and then I got quite cross because I thought I'm only allowed to write about posh white women now. It's quite annoying. And although there are quite a lot of them, and you can actually write quite a lot of novels about posh white women, indeed Philippa Gregory has, how do you deal with that? Do you just not let it bother you and plough on, or what do you do? And my name's Charlotte Eager, by the way.
Hello.
Just so you can remember and buy it when it comes out in about 5 years' time.
How would I do
and
that?
I loved The Marriage Portrait.
Thank you very much. I think probably research is the answer, and talking to as many people as you can, and I think maybe you should give it a go and see how it feels. And if it feels wrong, then maybe there's a reason for that.
Thank you. I've just turned them into a major character with a massive twist. That's the best way I could do.
Well, good luck is all I can say.
But would you ever stop yourself writing about a character from a different background? Or?
Do you know, I mean, I think it's something you have to consider, definitely. And I think there are certain things I probably wouldn't write about because I think, I could write about them, but should I? Am I the right person to tell that story? And I think you do have to make those choices, certainly. I think you have to be careful.
Are there other questions? Yes, thank you.
I just wondered whether you had a favourite out of all the books you've written.
I don't actually. I mean, it's funny. I feel it's a bit like asking if I've got a favourite child. I actually don't, and it would feel wrong if I did. But I should say that the one that I love the most is always the one I haven't yet started. That one, because that one in my mind is absolutely perfect, and it's not been frustrating in any way, and I haven't failed in my vision of what it should be. And that one, it's just, it's flawless.
Do you have a favourite of one of Maggie's books?
Hamnet. I have to say, your account of a child dying. My daughter died, and it is the nearest thing. You absolutely nailed it. I cannot tell you. You wrote so beautifully.
Thank you.
And it meant a lot.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. But I imagine you must have had response from other readers in a similar situation because it's so,
Yes, I do. There are a certain number of letters about exactly that.
Yeah, exactly, because there's something where that fiction can really touch people, can't it? Are there other questions? You see there? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Look, I've been a huge fan for years. I wondered what prompted the impulse to shift to historical fiction, because I had always thought of you as a writer of contemporary fiction, and Hamnet sort of felt like a big, fantastic shift, which you've carried on with The Marriage Portrait. And I wonder what prompted that, if there was any particular impulse to go into historical fiction.
I didn't really, it's funny, I try actually deliberately to steer away from the idea that I am writing historical, capital H, fiction, capital F. I try really to think about it in exactly the same way as I would a book that was set in the present day. I try not to make any particular shifts in, I just approach it as a story, really. It is not, I'm sure I'll write contemporary fiction again. I don't actually, but when I think about what I want to write next, I don't think, well, I can't do that because it's this, or I can't do that because it's that. I think the way to write the best book you possibly can is to write the one you can't not write. You have to write the one that's tugging at your sleeve most insistently. And that's always going to be the one that will be your best book, I think. So I try not to think too much about what genre it will be or which part of the bookshop it will be shelved in. It's something you can't think about. You have to just follow your nose.
And people can be a bit prejudiced about their reading, can't they? They're only reading contemporary books or only reading historical fiction or not reading fiction. They kind of get sort of bees in their bonnet, can't they?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, over here. I was wondering, I love the marriage portrait, and I've always been fascinated with the Medici and that time in Florence. And I was wondering if you have a particular time and place that you sort of feel you have an affinity for, that perhaps you want to write about, because I always find there's particular times in history which I feel I kind of can't get enough of. So do you have that as well?
I don't, but it sounds great to have that affinity and that kind of being drawn to it. And I have to say, I didn't know a huge amount about the Italian Renaissance when I started writing this book, but I have to say I loved doing all the research. And I lived near Florence for a while in a town called Lucca. So I had actually
lucky you!
I know, it was a tough job, but somebody had to do it. So I did know Florence quite well, and I had been to the Uffizi Gallery, and I've always been quite fascinated with Agnolo Bronzino's portraits, just because they are so spookily real. I think of all those painters, he's the one that's almost, it seems ridiculous to call him photorealistic, but there is that sense about them. They are very, very, they almost kind of leap out of the canvas, and there's the detail of their dresses and their jewels and their hair and their medals. I was actually really amused because I realised that every time Cosimo de' Medici had commissioned a portrait of himself by Agnolo Bronzino, he's always wearing armour. And I had a look through all his kind of history, and I thought, I don't think he's ever fought in a battle. So I love the idea that his armour is totally pristine without a single mark upon it. But no, I don't think there's a particular time that I feel very obsessed with. But I do notice that my daughter, for reasons known only to herself, is very obsessed with the 18th century and often dresses as if she's an 18th century gentleman, which I love, and it is rather startling for our neighbours, but I'm happy to go with it. Why not carry a cane when you're 14?
Well, I don't think we can have a better ending than that. I think it's going to be a life's motto, isn't it? So just a reminder that Maggie will not be signing books, she'll be stamping your book with her fancy new stamp. But this has been just really fascinating, such a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. Thank you so much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.